services go through the parking lot.
There you go, everybody.
You talked about them down. I mean, if they're involved with other clubs, they just may not be interested in another group. That's okay. You want to? You don't? You don't?
Just come to our shack and hit him.
We have the mic on? Is the microphone on? Well, I have it on. Is it on? Okay. Okay, very good. So the crowd is thinning. We're down to the hardcore.
Maybe Jesus wasn't the popular topic. They didn't want to hear the heresy.
Yeah. Well, this is our final session. And today we take a look at the person of Jesus in the Islamic faith. We began, in the past weeks, we've talked, for example, about the figure of Adam and Eve and the story of the garden, in which the basic case reflecting Islamic theology in the Quranic treatment of the story of the garden has to do with the resistance to the notion of original sin that had developed as a Christian interpretation of the story of the garden, and therefore in Christian interpretation establishing the need for a Savior figure such as Jesus, whose sacrificial death would save us from what it was that Adam unleashed on us, the entire human race, in the fall into original sin in the garden. And so Islam is very resistant to that notion and resists the idea that, as I said last week, I think if you make a mess, it's your responsibility to clean it up. You don't depend upon a Savior because you are accountable before God for your own actions. Now that's not to say that God is, in Islamic view, a harsh taskmaster, because they understand God to be gracious and merciful, and that God will bend over backwards to make it possible for you to clean up your mess. In fact, I dare say that they would understand God as being involved somehow in helping you to clean up that mess, but it's your mess, and you ultimately are accountable for it. When we were looking at Noah last week, recall, again, consistent with Islamic theology in their telling of the tale, it's not about this person, Noah, who in some way unstated in the biblical story is righteous. It's about Noah who, in spite of the fact that he is righteous, is selected to go on the ark. But in the biblical tradition, it makes no difference, really, because the same problems ensue after the ark. And all of the righteous people have to get onto the ark because in Islamic theology, one of the main points is that every wicked person must meet judgment and every righteous person must be saved for heaven. And so no righteous person can make it onto the ark. And so one of the interesting features that we saw last week was that one of Noah's own kids doesn't make it onto the ark because he refuses to think that that's important. Yes, Sue?
How many people went on the ark then in their stories?
Well, they don't talk about a great number of people, and I don't know what conversations they've had about that. The tradition is 8. Now, I think that Islam probably is willing to stretch that a bit, but every righteous person made it onto the ark.
Were only 8 righteous people?
Well, could be.
They don't state a number in the actual scripture. They're understanding
Well, I think there's a big conversation about it
But
in
does it
Islamic
say
tradition.
8?
Well, I think that if I recall correctly, there is a reference to 8. But there isn't, certainly in the biblical tradition.
Is not.
What?
Is not.
Is not.
There is not a number in the Bible.
Yeah, in the biblical tradition.
People,
Well,
you don't know.
I-
You
I-
have the kids and his wife and him,
yeah,
but we don't know.
3 kids, their wives, Noah and his wife.
There could be some in-laws.
So anyway, the telling of these stories, as varied as they might be, all try to give expression to what the fundamental commitments are within that particular religious tradition that is telling the story. The one who tells the story has the right to tell the story in a way that is consistent with what their beliefs are. And so today we're going to take a look at the story of Jesus in the Islamic tradition. And there are a number of surahs that are important in taking a look at the character of Jesus in the Islamic tradition. Surah 3 is one of them. It's called Al-Imran. Imran is the name that the Islamic tradition gives to Mary's father. His name becomes in Christian tradition Joachim, but that's not biblical. He is unnamed in the biblical tradition. I think that Anna is named, but Joachim is not, and Anna is Mary's mother in the Christian tradition. And in the story in Surah 3, Mary's mother dedicates her child to God. She laments her barrenness and prays to God, reminiscent of the way in the Old Testament tradition Hannah, the mother of Samuel, laments her barrenness. And so there's a lot of connections of biblical language that's picked up. And Imran's wife dedicates her child to God. Let me read this section to you. In Surah 3, the family of Imran, verses 35 and 36. Does print get smaller for you? Yes. 35 and 36. Imran's wife, that's Mary's mother, said, "Lord, I have dedicated what is growing in my womb entirely to you. So accept this from me. You are the one who hears and knows all." But when she gave birth, she said, "My Lord, I have given birth to a girl," which sounds like it would surprise her. I'm not sure exactly how we're intended to read that line. But it goes on to say, "Then God knew best what she had given birth to. The male is not like the female." And then it continues with Mary's mother's speech. "I name her Mary and commend her and her offspring to your protection from the rejected Satan. Her Lord graciously accepted her and made her grow in goodness and entrusted her into the charge of Zechariah." Now remember that Zechariah is the priest in the temple, one of the chief priests in the temple at that time. So Mary's mother brings Mary to the temple in order to protect her and her seed from Satan. This protection of the purity of Mary is an important theme in the Christian tradition also. We don't read about this in the biblical tradition. There's not much that in the biblical tradition that talks about Mary being protected. And there certainly is nothing in the biblical tradition, I don't mean Mary, Mary, and there's certainly nothing in the biblical tradition about Mary being brought to the temple. Here again we have a theme that's consistent with the story of Samuel, born to Hannah, and as Thanksgiving they bring Samuel as a boy to the temple, and Samuel's there with the priest Eli. You perhaps remember that story. And so Samuel is understood to have been raised in the temple. Yes?
Sounds like they picked up on the wrong story. Like it should have been Zachariah and Elizabeth who were there, miraculously got a child born protected.
Well,
That's a biblical story. But this is other.
yeah, well, they're interested at this point in establishing Mary's identity and Mary's purity. So Mary is assigned to the care of Zechariah, and one of the things that it says in the Quran is that let's see if it's in here. Entrusted to charge of Zechariah. Well, we'll perhaps come back to that later. But there's a verse in here that then talks about Mary being mysteriously provisioned by an angel. The assumption is that Mary never leaves the temple. She's protected up to the age of 3 by her mother, who only allows pure girls to come and play with her daughter Mary. And then at 3, she's taken to the temple, where she is protected in the purity of the temple. So the stress is on the purity of Mary, and that Zechariah goes into her room and sees that she's being provisioned with food. And he asks her, Mary, what's going on here? And she tells him that an angel brings me food. So there's this interesting story in the tradition about Mary's mysterious provisioning. This story is also in one of the early Gospels called the Infancy Gospel of James, or the Proto-Evangelium, or the Proto-Gospel of James, which dates from about the 2nd century, which also celebrates these same sorts of stories. So this story was developed apparently in the Christian tradition shortly after you might say the closure of the canon, if there was such a thing, toward the end of the 1st century or the beginning of the 2nd century. Just a matter of decades later, you can see this traditioning process going crazy in the Christian community, where all of these stories are being developed. And these stories are picked up in such texts as this infancy gospel of James. So then the story goes on in chapter 3, verses 38 following. Here's that verse I was looking for right up here. Whenever Zechariah went in to see her, this is the translation of the Quran that I'm reading. When Zechariah went in to see her in her sanctuary, he found her supplied with provisions. He said, Mary, how is it that you have these provisions? And she said, they're from God. God provides limitlessly for whoever he will. Then and there, Zechariah prayed to his Lord, saying, Lord, from your grace grant me virtuous offspring. You hear every prayer. The angels called out to him while he stood praying in the sanctuary. God gives you good news of John, confirming a word from God. So here's the annunciation to John of the coming birth, of Zechariah, announcing the coming birth of John. He will be noble and chaste, a prophet, one of the righteous. He said, my Lord, how can I have a son when I am so old and my wife is barren? And the angel said, "It will be so. God does whatever God wills." He said, "My Lord, give me a sign." And the angel says, "Your sign is that you will not communicate with anyone for 3 days except by gestures." Does this remind you of anything in the gospel tradition about Zechariah? Although here, it's a sign that is provided to Zechariah in order to demonstrate the truth of the promise that has been made about the coming birth of John, and it is understood to last 3 days. How long does it last in the gospel tradition? Until John's birth. It lasts through the entire pregnancy and until John's birth. And also, it's not understood to be a sign so much as a punishment because of Zechariah's disbelief. So you can see the common themes that are picked up in the tradition, and I would suspect that these themes are not simply changed in mid-flight by the Islamic tradition, but that the Islamic tradition is reflecting upon the way the storytelling evolved over the centuries in between. Then Zechariah commanded the silence for 3 days, and he is unable to speak, in Luke at least, in Luke chapter 1, he's not able to speak until John's birth. So in chapter 3, Surah 3:42 following, Mary is said to have been chosen above all women. Mary is given news of a word from God, which is an interesting use of the term because, of course, the word it becomes so important in Christian tradition because of the use in John, and in the beginning was the Word, and the Word becomes flesh, and so the word is sort of a signal for something that is going on here. Jesus is given as a word sent down to Mary and a spirit. And then it has an aside comment that Jesus is among those closest to God. But this is a statement that is made in the context of denying the Trinity. So if we take a look at chapter 4, verses way down the road, 171 and 172, I'll get there eventually here. Not there yet. Past it.
Is the spirit that sent one of those lesser angels you talked about?
I'm sorry?
The spirit that is sent, is that one of those lesser angels?
No, the word ruch in Arabic is similar to the word ruach in Hebrew, and that's the term that's used. So that's not an angel. It'd be more closely related to the idea of the breath of God, the Spirit of God. So 171. People of the book, do not go to excess in your religion. That's us. That's the Jews and Christians, or people of the book. Do not go to excess in your religion, and do not say anything about God except the truth. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was nothing more than a messenger of God, like Muhammad. His word directed to Mary, a spirit from him. So believe in God and his messengers, and do not speak of a trinity. Stop this. That is better for you. God is only one God. Well, you see, there's Islam's central comment regarding what they always considered to be rather loosey-goosey language when talking about the unity of God on one hand and a trinity on the other hand. They're pretty adamant in not wanting to go in that direction. Jesus was like Muhammad. He was a messenger. He was a prophet. That first screen I showed, he's a prophet who confirms the Torah. So as the Torah in the Islamic tradition was understood to have been given by Moses, so Jesus is given the Evangel, is the word in Arabic, that Jesus is given the Evangel, the Evangelion, the gospel, and the gospel confirms the Torah. And recall the point that I've made that in Islamic theology, none of the prophets spoke anything different than what any of the other prophets had spoken. They all confirm one another. So that's an important point in Islamic theology. Surprisingly, in the Islamic tradition, there is a very strong stress on Mary's virginity. When Mary is promised a son in the Quran, she protests very much like she does in the biblical tradition. She says, "How can this happen?" And God responds by saying, God creates what he wills simply by saying, "Be." And God breathed the divine spirit into Mary without benefit of intercourse. My experience is that Muslims are very sincere and dedicated to this theological point of Mary's virginity. They hammer that harder than perhaps many Christians do. And many Christians, I think, and scholars are fairly thoughtful about what is that whole thing about. But Islam is very insistent that this is taken literally, and that Mary's virginity is very important in their tradition. Yeah?
That makes, though, Jesus different than the other prophets. That's never mentioned about any of the other prophets. Do they deal with that at all? In that, how come Mary was a virgin giving birth to Jesus, but Muhammad's mother wasn't a virgin, supposedly, unless that's in there.
No, that's right.
It's only Jesus why do they want to stress that so much? Why?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. One possibility, it was so deeply embedded in the tradition that came to them that they just couldn't get around it. The development of the Islamic tradition could not jettison that particular statement of faith. The other is that Jesus is like Muhammad, but Jesus is, I think, second to Muhammad. In the Islamic mind, Jesus is second to Muhammad. So they're all equal, but Muhammad is the first among equals, and Jesus is the second among equals. And so there's this real concern to protect the integrity of Jesus, but they're not going to go so far as to ascribe divinity to him. They'll ascribe virgin birth to him, but they're not going to take that other step. So then we move into the stories of Mary's deliverance of Jesus. It says that in chapter 19, which is the chapter called Mary, let me move to that chapter, 19, verses 16 through 23. Let me just read these verses to you. Mention in the Quran the story of Mary. Now that illustrates a point that I made that, see, they're talking about some other topic. But while they're talking about this topic, Mary comes to mind. And so the reader is invited then to consider Mary. And usually Muslims would understand that these commands like this are addressed to Muhammad, who is receiving these revelations. So it's you, Muhammad, mention in the Quran the story of Mary. She withdrew from her family to a place in the east, which is kind of interesting, because it's not really a place in the East in the biblical tradition, and secluded herself away. We sent our spirit to appear before her in the form of a perfected man. She said, I seek the Lord's mercy protection against you. She's afraid when she is confronted by this strange man. If you have any fear of him, do not approach. Of God, if you fear God, do not approach. But he said, I am but a messenger from your Lord, come to announce to you the gift of a pure son. She said, how can I have a son when no man has touched me? I have not been unchaste. And he said, this is what your Lord said. It is easy for me. We shall make him a sign to all people, a blessing from us. And so it was ordained, she conceived him. And then the birth itself is very interesting. She withdrew to a distant place, and when the pains of childbirth drove her to cling to the trunk of a palm tree, she exclaimed, I wish I had been dead and forgotten long before all this. She's in such pain and misery that she wishes that she were dead. But a voice cried to her from below, do not worry. Your Lord has provided a stream at your feet, and if you shake the trunk of the palm tree toward you, it will deliver fresh, ripe dates for you. So eat, drink, be glad, and say to anyone you may see, I have vowed to the Lord of mercy to abstain from conversation, and I will not talk to anyone today. Well, who is this that's talking to her? Well, in Islamic tradition, this is the infant that she has just given birth to. The infant Jesus speaks to her with reassurance, indicating the stream beside her, instructing her to shake the date palm and speak to no one. Now, this story, too, interestingly enough, is part of our Christian tradition. You probably never heard this story before, but it was there. All in the gospel of the Syriac infancy gospel. Don't know, the scholars are less sure about when this gospel originated. Some scholars suggest it goes back fairly early, maybe 3rd or 4th century. But the earliest manuscripts that we have are much later. And so the question that scholars have debated about this particular story is whether this the infancy gospel, the Syriac infancy gospel predated the Quranic tradition or postdated it, which came first. But it's clear that in any event, the Syriac infancy gospel is so Christian-oriented that it can't have been written by a Muslim. It had to have been written and read and celebrated in the Christian community because it uses all the right language, has the right understanding of Jesus. And so scholars are divided about how this story comes over into the Islamic tradition. But here again, we see that these traditions were just going crazy during these centuries. All sorts of stories developing. That Jesus, here in this case, that Jesus as a baby speaks to his mother as soon as he's born. Is there a question?
Comment. There's I believe, French Christmas carol that has a very similar story with the infant Jesus bringing down the cherries. Not dates, but anyhow. Yeah. Well, you can just see the storytelling going crazy. Most of these stories didn't make the big time. They didn't get selected in to become part of the canonical tradition. But they were there, circulating in the Christian tradition all over the place. And then finally, when Mary returns in Islamic tradition, when Mary returns to her community, she's immediately accosted by her enemies who look at her, look at the baby and say, Mary, what have you done? Naturally, she went back to her people carrying the child, and they said, Mary, you have done something terrible. sister of Aaron. Now, this has been the subject of a lot of comment because you remember from the Old Testament, perhaps the priest Aaron's sister was Miriam, and so now it's Mary. Are they confusing Mary with Miriam? I mean, I don't think it would be impossible that happens. Or are they simply associating her with the temple where she had, according to tradition, grown up? But in any event, your father was not an evil man. Your mother was not unchaste. And Mary has promised that she will not speak to anyone. And so she points at Jesus, whom she's carrying, and they said, "How can we converse with an infant?" And then Jesus speaks and says, "I am a servant of God. He has granted me the scripture," that is the evangel, the evangel, "it made me a prophet, made me blessed wherever I may be, so he commanded me to pray, to give alms as long as I live." Now remember, praying and almsgiving are two of the major pillars in the Islamic tradition. Right behind the Shahada, the confession, and then you have almsgiving and prayer and almsgiving. To cherish my mother. He did not make me domineering or graceless. Peace was on me the day I was born and will be on me the day I die and the day I am raised to life again. Such was Jesus, the Son of Mary. Jesus' first sermon. And here's a connection with the Christian tradition. The Syriac infancy gospel at the bottom, right away at the beginning of the Syriac infancy gospel, I think it's in chapter 1, where you have this speech given by Jesus when he too speaks from the cradle. "I am Jesus, the Son of God, the Logos." Well, no Muslim is going to have Jesus say that. So this can't have been a Muslim writer. It has to have been a Christian writer. "The Logos whom thou hast brought forth, as the angel Gabriel announced to thee, and my Father has sent me for the salvation of the world." So in both traditions, we had this story of the infant Jesus speaking from the cradle. His first miracle, I guess you might call it. Oh, did I show that up there? Yeah. There. Wow, where did I go? Okay. Okay, there's Jesus' first sermon. And then the Islamic tradition is also aware of details of Jesus' ministry. I mean, they know these stories. They don't know the versions that we know. They know, you might call it, a much more advanced or evolved tradition as the tradition process went on. So they know, for example, in Surah 3, a story of Jesus making birds of clay. And he breathes into the bird, and the bird flies away. This is a celebrated story in Christian tradition. So, for example, in the infancy gospel of Thomas, which tells stories about Jesus when he's 5 years old and older. See, the infancy gospel of James, or the proto-evangelion of James, tells stories about Mary's birth and about Mary's pregnancy, being raised in the temple, and her pregnancy and her relationship with Joseph, and then finally the birth of Jesus. The infancy gospel of Thomas tells stories about the young boy Jesus. at 5 years of age. I was talking to someone earlier about the fact that I taught a class not too terribly long ago titled Jesus: the Early Years. And they had a ton of stories that they told about Jesus, and one of them is in this Gospel of Thomas. And Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas comes across as sort of a roughneck little kid. He gets in fights with other kids. He curses them. He is accused of shoving kids off of a roof. His father gets livid with him, and then he curses his father. But they all turn out to show Jesus' power. His power to heal, but also his power to teach. And so you have these stories. What's the one story that we have of Jesus, you might say, youth? The one story in the biblical tradition. 12 years of age in the temple. That's it. That's where these stories end. For like in the Gospel of the infancy Gospel of Thomas, that's the last story in the whole list of stories of Jesus' activities from the age of 5 onward. Now, I didn't look it up, but in the Gospel, I think it's in the Gospel of John. Maybe you biblical scholars can help me out. Somewhere toward the end of I think it's the Gospel of John, that says, well, these are the stories that we could relate, but we could go on here forever, and if we were to tell all of the stories that were told about Jesus, all the books in the world wouldn't be able to contain them. Isn't that, recognize it, familiar? I think it's toward the end of the Gospel of John. Well, so the hint is that even at the time of the writing of the Gospel of John, these stories about Jesus proliferated all over the place. And some of them, survived to come down in tradition in the infancy Gospels of James, the infancy Gospel of Thomas, and the Syriac infancy Gospel. So Jesus makes birds of clay, breathes into it, and it flies away. Now, interestingly enough, that's in the Gospel of Thomas also, but it's also in the Arabic infancy gospel, in which now, I think it's related several times, it's sort of elaborated on, and Jesus doesn't make clay birds, he's making a whole zoo. And making them walk around, and the birds are flying, and so you can see how these traditions just get elaborated on. But they also know, more seriously, that Jesus, that first slide, prophet confirming the Torah, that Jesus confirms the Torah. But they're also aware of the fact that Jesus undid some things. And in the Islamic mind, it was especially the Jewish food laws, purity laws, that Jesus undid. Well, how do you square it with the fact that Jesus confirms the Torah if he is also canceling some things in the Torah, namely the food laws, which I think are a stand-in for the purity codes of the biblical tradition? And the Islamic answer to this is that he modifies food laws, making some lawful that had been forbidden because of the disobedience of the Jews. So the notion here is that God punished the Jews by making some food off limits to them. And so what Jesus does is to go back to plan A and cancels out God's punishment by allowing food now. However, what they don't go into at this point is the fact that Islam also has some restrictions on food, namely on pork. For some reason, they follow the Jewish tradition about the nature of pork, and also alcohol. And they also have kosher foods. It's called halal. So you'll see halal food in a lot of grocery stores. So think of that as equivalent to kosher food in Judaism. That animals have to be slaughtered the right way, but everything is allowable except for pork and alcohol. Yes?
I was going to say, what is the difference between kosher and halal?
Well, I really don't know. In Judaism, it has to do with the way the prayers that are said, and I'm trying to remember if there's a command to have the animal face a certain direction. I can't remember that. But the blood, the neck has to be slit in such a way that the blood is drained in a particular way. And I don't think you can shoot it. Yeah.
I had an Islamic Muslim woman who was a science teacher,
Uh-huh.
mentioned why pork is not on the list of foods. It's because the alimentary canal of a pig is so short that food passes through the corn. I've seen it passes through without being digested, and so pigs will eat of that, so they're unclean.
There have been all sorts of responses given. Jews struggle with the same. You say this woman was Jewish or Islamic? She was Islamic. She was Muslim. Jews also have their own answers to this. Oftentimes you'll talk with Jews that they'll say, well, they knew already back then that pork was dangerous because of trichinosis. And you could hang pork out and it would spoil faster than beef or chicken. And so the Jews just knew from experience that you didn't eat pork. Well, that could be. It could be that it has something to do with the alimentary canal. I suspect deep down that all of those traditions are struggling hard to try and give rational explanations for it. If you read a book called Purity and Danger by Mary Douglas, an anthropologist, which has had a profound impact, I think, on the conversation. Mary Douglas argues that the whole issue behind the purity codes in the biblical and Islamic tradition have to do not with something like the spoilage of meat or alimentary canals or something like that. It has to do with the observation. Mary Douglas was a structuralist anthropologist, which means that, like Carl Jung, the psychologist, she was interested in subconscious patterns of thinking, the structures of the brain that try to organize things in patterns. And Douglas argued that the reason behind the purity codes has to do with the awareness that some things just didn't seem to fit. And so, for example, you could eat fish because they had scales, but you didn't eat other things in the ocean that didn't have scales. And you can eat cows and goats because and animals that chew their cud because they have split hooves and they chew their cud. You know what chewing your cud means? The digestive system of a cow. But the awareness that a pig, although it has a split hoof, doesn't have the same digestive system. It doesn't chew its cud. And so Douglas argued that the problem is that the pig seems to be out of place. It's this weird mixture of things that just simply doesn't belong. Now, I don't know if Douglas is right or not, but you can see that this is just one more voice in that struggle to try and figure out why is it that societies have declared some things to be off limits and other things are okay? Why is it that we don't eat dog, whereas in other places, that's good eating? Sorry? I'm sorry, horse meat?
Horse meat.
Yeah.
In France, that's...
Yeah, right. That's tasty. Like my brother who saw in Tijuana one time a person carrying a, oh, no. She had, he saw a person carrying a horse head into a taco shop. But and it wasn't a very good looking horse head. But there's this woman, my brother also saw this woman pick up a carcass off the road. And he saw her and she had it hauling it off, and she said, "Buen comida," good food, good eating. So in any event, they were aware of Jesus' ministry, that he healed, that he raised the dead. They celebrated that Jesus did away with some of the restrictive food laws because they were understood to have been given by God as punishment for the disobedience of the Jews. They know the disciples. In fact, they're probably more charitable, except for this one exception I'll talk about here in a second. They're pretty charitable toward the disciples. Much more so perhaps than even some of the Christian stories, which, take a look at Peter, the way Peter is presented sometimes. "Get behind me, Satan." You wouldn't hear a Muslim associate Peter with Satan. And Judas, one of the betrayer. But the disciples profess their deep faith in Surah 5, which is called a table spread. The reason it's called the table spread is because the disciples want Jesus to send a sign. Let me read this text to you, 5:111. There it is. Oh, here's this verse refers to something we just talked about. "Then God will say, 'Jesus, son of Mary, remember my favor to you and to your mother.'" Well, this just goes to show that you'll come across references to Jesus willy-nilly all over the place. There's no one place you go to read about Jesus, because he's invoked in order to illustrate a point in a larger conversation. So, "Jesus, son of Mary, remember my favor to you and to your mother, how I strengthened you with the Holy Spirit so that you spoke to people in your infancy." That's a reference, obviously, to that tradition of the miraculous speaking from the cradle, or in Mary's arms. "And as a grown man, how I taught you the scripture and wisdom, the Torah and the gospel, how by my leave you fashioned the shape of a bird out of clay." There's another reference to that story of Jesus making a bird and having it fly away. "You breathed into it, and it became by my leave a bird. How by my leave you healed the blind person and the leper. How by my leave you brought the dead back to life. How I restrained the children of Israel from harming you when you brought them clear signs, and those of them who disbelieved, saying, 'This is clearly nothing but sorcery.'" Now, Muhammad himself had been accused of sorcery. And so this is going to be dear to the heart of the Islamic tradition when they have once again see a connection being made to Muhammad by one of their stories. And then in verse 112, and verse 111, "And how I inspired the disciples to believe in me and my messengers. They said, 'We believe and bear witness that we devote ourselves to God.'" So they're faithful, devoted believers. "When the disciples said, 'Jesus, son of Mary, can your Lord send down a feast to us from heaven?' He said, 'Beware of God if you are true believers.' They said, 'We wish to eat from it, to have our hearts reassured, to know that you have told us the truth and to be witnesses of it.'" Well, they're wanting a sign to confirm what they've been told and what they supposedly believe. "Jesus, son of Mary, said, 'Lord, send down to us a feast from heaven so that we can have a festival, the first and last of us, and a sign from you. Provide for us. You are the best provider.' And then God responds, I will send it down to you, but anyone who disbelieves after this will be punished with a punishment that I will not inflict on anyone else in the world. Well, so in other words, the disciples have just been claimed to be true devout believers, but then they demonstrate a certain amount of questionable, not maybe disbelief, but at least questioning. They want reassurance that what they've been told is accurate. So they ask for this miracle, and God responds, okay, once. I'll do this for you once. And this, I suspect, reflects both a biblical and an Islamic concern about testing God. And demanding signs. Remember Paul's language. Jews seek signs. Greeks seek wisdom. But what do as Christians? We preach Christ crucified. I could spend a whole hour talking about that text. But here you have a story of the disciples. And what is this table set? It's the experience of having a table full of food brought down from heaven. It's interesting because there are, I think, reflections of biblical traditions in there. So, for example, you have the story of the Last Supper. You have the stories of the feeding miracles. You have the story of Peter's visionary experience in Acts, where this sheet of food is brought down, and which leads Peter to understand that God has declared clean whatever God has created. And so there are a lot of these food analogies, but we don't have anything in the biblical tradition about this sort of a miracle. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if in some gospel somewhere that there was a story that would pop up that would show the connection between our biblical texts and the Islamic tradition here in Surah 5. Jesus' warning, okay, but if you don't believe after this, you would be punished as no one ever has been before. Now, here's where the rubber hits the road in terms of Jesus in the Quranic tradition. We've already read one text. It is blasphemy to say that God is Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of Mary, and Jesus himself denies this. The Quran says, O Son of Mary, did you say to people, worship me and my mother as gods in derogation of God? Mary is being asked this. Oh, no, Jesus himself is being asked this. And Jesus will say, glory be to you. It was not for me to say what I had no right to say. If I had said such a thing, you would indeed have known it. You know what is in my heart, even though I do not know what is in yours. Truly, you fully know all that is hidden and unseen. Never did I say to them anything except what you commanded me to say, which is, worship God, my Lord and your Lord. So even on Jesus' own lips is a denial of his own divinity. Yeah.
You see that reflected in the Bible as well, in some texts. It's like, I don't know the hour, only my Father knows that.
Yeah.
So there are some texts, there's high Christology in the Bible and there's low Christology.
Why do you call me good? No one is good but God. Yeah. It's not problem-free in the biblical tradition.
It is not. There are definitely signs that Jesus is God as well. There's certainly.
But in the Gospel of John especially, I think it's John that tends to heighten this, and John's Johannine heightened Christology, where Jesus is one, as I am one in you, and you are one. And so there's this participation of Jesus in God the Father. But the Christian community probably has not struggled enough with the biblical interpretation of that whole problem in Christian tradition. And then next, I hope that I covered everything there. Yeah, right, okay. And we've talked about this before too. the Islamic insistence that, well, this is a little bit of a spin on it. The Islamic tradition insists that Jesus was not killed, in spite of the boasts of the Jews. It criticizes the Jews. The Quranic tradition criticizes Jews for boasting about having killed Jesus, which is kind of a macabre thing. But the Quranic tradition then criticizes the Jews for saying that they did. Jesus was not killed. It was only a semblance. Let me read these texts. Surah 4, 157. Surah 4, 157. God has sealed them, the Jews, in their disbelief, so they believe only a little. And because they disbelieved and uttered a terrible slander against Mary, I'm not sure to what tradition that refers, could refer to any number of developing traditions, and said, "We have killed the Messiah Jesus, son of Mary, the messenger of God." And then it says, "They did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, though it was made to appear like that to them. Those who disagreed about him are full of doubt, with no knowledge to follow, only supposition. They certainly did not kill him." God, well, what happened then? It was a semblance, the Quranic tradition, the Islamic tradition, it was a semblance of Jesus that was crucified. Now, what's that mean? There's huge debate in the Islamic tradition about what that means. Does it mean perhaps that Jesus only fainted on the cross, but he didn't die? Or does it mean that someone else was on the cross and it wasn't Jesus? There are various responses given to this. But the assertion that is made is that Jesus did not die. He was not crucified on the cross. God raised him up to himself. So the Islamic tradition understands that Jesus was raised by God to God's side in heaven. But Jesus was not crucified. Well, what's the point of this? Christians might wonder. I suspect that the point is that they're denying the significance of the Christian development of the tradition that Jesus died a sacrificial death for the forgiveness of sin. There's resistance to understanding Jesus as being sort of the Lamb of God slain for the sin of all humankind. That goes against Islamic theology. So that I think the main point here is to avoid the scandal of having Jesus killed as a sacrificial offering. Jesus wasn't killed. He was taken by God into heaven. Yes?
And what about Muhammad? Was Muhammad died? Do they say that Muhammad was taken up and didn't die? I mean, how does that compare to Muhammad?
No. Muhammad was not taken up into heaven. Well, I'll come back to that in a second.
He says he will return to judge. Now, is Muhammad?
No, Muhammad will not return to judge.
So Jesus looks kind of pretty good.
Yeah. Oh, as I said, he's right up there in big time in the Islamic tradition. He's not God. He's not divine. You can't associate anything that is not God with God. And so Jesus is not God. He falls under that category. But in other ways, he looks awfully good.
Yeah, how is it that he will return to judge, but not Muhammad? But Muhammad is ranked above Jesus in all of all.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if Muhammad has a place in final judgment. I don't think so, because they assume that Muhammad is in his grave. If you want to see Muhammad, go over to Medina. That's the second most holy city in the Islamic tradition. That's where Muhammad's tomb is. So that's where Muhammad is. He's not in heaven. The Mahdi, that in Islam, developing Islamic tradition. Yeah, see, it's been 10 years since I've done it. It's brain rust. In Islamic tradition, especially in the Shia tradition, but it probably also filters over into the Sunni tradition, a major branch of Shia is what they call the Twelvers, who argue that there were 12 generations of imams after Muhammad, and the 12th imam was miraculously assumed into heaven. He disappeared. They call him the disappeared imam. And that gave rise then to the cult of the Mahdi. Well, not the cult, the belief in the return of the Mahdi. And so a large chunk of Islam believes that the Mahdi will return, many of them associated with the 12th imam, and that the Mahdi will return as the judge. And some even say that the Mahdi will be the judge of Muslims and Jesus will be the judge of Christians. Well, that's not Quranic, but it was a developing speculative tradition. I see.
What's a Mahdi?
Think of the Messiah. Think of the notion of a returning Messiah.
Were all 12 Mahdis or just the one?
No, just the 12th imam. In this, among the 12ers, now there are other groups, but the 12ers are the major group that talk about the Mahdi. So that if you saw, for example, the story of not Lawrence of Arabia, Gordon leading the British army against the Mahdi in Sudan, I think. What was the name of that movie? But what's that?
Lawrence of Arabia?
No, it wasn't Lawrence of Arabia. That's World War I. This was back in the 1800s. Cartoon. Yeah, well, that movie starring Laurence Olivier as don't quote me on that either, but it had to do with Gordon, General Gordon of the British Army, fighting against the Mahdi and his followers. That was a messianic movement back in the 1800s. I'm going to look it up. Google it. Okay. So the denial of Jesus' crucifixion is an important aspect, even though Jesus was assumed to heaven. And then Jesus prophesies the coming of Muhammad. In Surah 61, verse 6, O children of Israel, I am a messenger of God to you, confirming the Torah before me and giving the good news of a messenger to come after me whose name shall be Ahmad. And Ahmad is a form of the name Muhammad from the same root, Hamad, meaning to be praised or honored. And so the Islamic tradition makes a big deal of this. I remember the first time an Islamic imam said, Jesus predicted the coming of Muhammad. I said, what? Well, I hadn't gotten into it deep enough to understand what's going on here. That Jesus predicts, according to the Quran, the coming of Muhammad. Now, consider, for example, the Johannine tradition of the comforter or the advocate. The Greek term is parakletos, so that Jesus promises the disciples the coming of the parakletos, the comforter, who will give the community guidance. But in the Islamic tradition, they read that text in different ways. Two possibilities are to read it, change a letter here or there around, and instead of getting parakletos, comforter, you get the word periklutos, which means honored. And this would be the Greek translation of the name Muhammad, Ahmad. And so that's one way that Muslims understand the Johannine texts about the coming of the Parakletos. or they, a little more sleight of hand here, they read the name Muhammad as related to the Syriac root Naham, which means one who brings comfort. Well, I won't go into that. Either one works, but you can see that the Islamic community has always tried very hard to understand how it is that that the comforter that is referred to, the Parakletos, in John's Gospel, is related to the coming of Muhammad. That may be the end. That is the end of the program. So we should have some time. It's 2:33. We have about almost a half an hour. So here again, I've tried to show how within the Islamic tradition, it's the same story told in a whole different key, a whole different mode. And that it would be, I think, fair and perhaps even salutary to try and understand the storytelling from the perspective of the communities that are telling the story, number one. And number two, I think that even go a step further and suggest that in a self-critical sort of way, we undertake the same task as Christians to understand that the way we tell the story has certain nuances that certainly wouldn't have been there for other tellers of the story. I tried to illustrate that, for example, with the story of the Garden of Eden and how that gets reworked in the Christian community to become a story having to do with the origin of original sin and the need for a Savior to redeem us from that. And that doesn't mean that we need to call our telling of the story into question, but to understand that all of these stories come out of the middle of the faithful convictions of the community who is telling the story. And that sometimes is hard to do when you so vehemently disagree with some things going on in the other community. But I hope that we might be patient in terms of our relationships with our siblings in the Jewish and Islamic communities. Questions? Yes?
This is an answer.
Sorry?
This is an answer.
This?
The movie was cartoon.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was thinking that was right, but then I thought, well, maybe that was just the name of the city. That's the capital of Sudan, right, Khartoum? Yeah, and the general is Gordon. I can't remember his first name. He is the guy, same guy, by the way, whose name stands on the place in Jerusalem called Gordon's Calvary. That's because General Gordon, after his generaling days, was over in Jerusalem, and the place of Jesus' resurrection had been established, at least in Christian tradition, in the 4th century by Constantine's mom. And that's where they finally then built the church of the Holy Sepulchre. Has anybody here been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Oh, yeah, lots of folks. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. But if you go there, I've led tours over there with students, and I find it a very meaningful sanctuary. Maybe it's silly to place your hand down in the squared pit into which tradition has it that's where the cross was sunk that held Jesus, but it's still something that's sort of shivering when you do that, and to walk into the tomb and to see, although it was long ago hewed down by Muslim invaders, or at least enemies, that they destroyed the sanctuary that was there, hewed down this what's now just a bench, basically. But to see that, I found it very meaningful. But a lot of our students went in there and they were just appalled by what they saw, because it didn't remind them at all of anything remotely looking like what they expected Jesus' site of crucifixion to look like. And so I suspect that this is one reason why when Gordon was in Jerusalem and spotted this garden, which says in the Gospel of John that it was a garden, only the Gospel of John, Gordon looked out his window and said, that must be the place where Jesus was buried. And so that's how Gordon's Calvary got started, got its reputation. Yeah.
What we call the Garden Tomb.
That's the Garden Tomb. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that Gordon is the one who went to war against someone who was the self-proclaimed Mahdi, leading revolutionary forces against, I suppose Gordon was fighting on the side of the established authority against this revolutionary group. Yes?
When you talk about the traditions and the infancy gospels, where physically are they today?
Oh,
Are they accessible
yeah. Online.
online?
Or in libraries. What I would suggest doing is going online, Googling the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, or the Proto-Evangelion of Thomas, it's called by both names, or the Infancy Gospel of Jesus, or excuse me, the Infancy Gospel, no, the Proto-Evangelion of James, sorry, or the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, although 2 points, that's to be distinguished from the Gospel of Thomas, which is a whole different thing. This is the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And secondly, it starts when Jesus is 5 years old, so to call it the Infancy Gospel is a little bit of a misnomer, but that's what it's referred to as. So you could go online. There are a number of English translations that are available. You can read it in the original Latin, or in the case of the Syriac Infancy Gospel, in the original Syriac or Arabic. Online, or probably if you could go on Amazon.com and see what you could find. But those online sites will probably lead you to those hardcover or the paper-bound books. Other questions? Yes?
When I was in Jerusalem, I think it was on the Temple Mount, that Muhammad on his horse.
Oh, I was going to talk about this. When we were talking about Muhammad being in his grave and not having been assumed to heaven, that is correct. But there is a tradition in the Quran. It's hinted at in the Quran. It's not clearly depicted there, but it develops early on in Islamic tradition what's called the mirage. That Muhammad, in one night, on his faithful donkey Barak, or Baruch, or something like that, or Mubrak, I can't remember what the donkey's name was. He flew up to Jerusalem, and once in Jerusalem, he ascended to the various heavens, up to the seventh heaven, and had a confab with Jesus and Moses. Very much like, the story on the Transfiguration. And then he comes back down, and I think while up there is when when he received the directions on prayer, if I recall. I'm a little rusty on that. But that's called, part of that is called the mirage. I think the mirage is the ascent going up. So that's a celebrated tradition. Now, Muslims themselves don't know how to understand that. Some understand it literally. Some understand it figuratively or metaphorically. So Muslims themselves are, debate that whole story, but it's very well and deeply embedded in Islamic tradition. But in the Quran, there's only one small snippet that relates to it. Yeah?
How Jerusalem became their
Oh, well, I suppose so. Yeah. That's an interesting question because they took Jerusalem with their army fairly early. So the question would be, when did that tradition develop? And is the Quranic snippet a reflex of the larger tradition, or is it the root that caused the larger tradition to develop? And did that larger tradition develop after Jerusalem had already been taken? Good question. I don't know. But yeah, Jerusalem is the third holy city in Islamic tradition. And and I suspect that it has a great deal to do, one way or another, with the story of Muhammad's ascension to heaven. And in fact, if you've gone to into the Dome of the Rock, that's not the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Quranic tradition refers to the farthest most mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that's in Jerusalem. And just to the north of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, in the middle of the place that most Christians probably think is the main deal, it's not, but that's the Dome of the Rock. Why do they call it the Dome of the Rock? Well, first of all, it's probably Jewish and Christian scholars, archaeologists suggest that it's the grinding stone upon which David was commanded to build the temple. Or variously, it's the stone upon which the high altar stood out in front of the temple. But in any event, it had to do with the Solomonic temple eventually, and then Herod's temple. But in Islamic tradition, there's a box in there when you walk around the inside of the Dome of the Rock. Anybody done this? There's a big box you can walk up to, put your hand in it, and what is it that you feel? You feel the footprint left by Muhammad when he ascended into heaven. So, you know, that Christians, we have our niche where the cross was implanted. The Muslims have, you know, the footprint of Muhammad. So, interesting traditions. Other questions, comments? No, you ready to call it a day, call it a week, call it a course? Okay, if there's nothing else, I haven't been invited to teach anything else, and I'm not going to rush into it. But who knows what might happen in the future. So thank you for your attention, and we'll see you around. Have a happy Lent, I guess, if that's